right, hello and welcome to another Expert Inside interview. My name is John Golden from Sales Pop, online sales magazine and Pipeliner CRM, joining you as usual from sunny San Diego. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Walter Block, who is actually joining us today from Vancouver in British Columbia by way of Louisiana and Loyola. Walter is the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar Chair in Economics in the College of Business at Loyola University, New Orleans, an author of 24 books. His most famous one, Defending the Undefendable, has been translated into over a dozen foreign languages. And what we want to talk about today is about economics and the Austrian School of Economics in particular. And it's something, and I think it's an area where some people have heard of it. A lot of people have not. Some people think it belongs to like a bygone age, and others realize. So I guess, Walter, a good starting point would be most people, I think, are what they think of economics is they think of neoclassical economics, right? And, you know, where it's all the mathematical modeling and statistical analysis and all of that, whereas the Austrian school emphasizes deductive reasoning and understanding action, you know, the human action. So can you just give a kind of a high level differentiation between the Austrian school and neoclassical economics?
Well, first of all, let me just say that the Austrian School of Economics has got nothing to do with the country Austria and its economy. Mm-hmm. It's named the Austrian School because the people who started it were all in Austria. Beauvert, Menger, Mises, Hayek, all just were in Austria. That's why it's called the Austrian School. It's very similar to the Chicago School. Mm-hmm. The Chicago School of Economics got very little, if anything, nothing to do with the economics of the city of Chicago. It's rather that Milton Friedman and George Stigler, Gary Becker were all in Chicago. Mm-hmm. So it's called the Chicago School.
Yeah.
Okay, so what is the difference between the mainstream neoclassical economics and Austrian economics? Murray Rothbard used to say it very interestingly put. He would say that there's the saltwater economists. That would be Harvard, MIT, and Berkeley, saltwater, and sort of left-ish mainstreamers. And then there's the plain water or non-salt water, and that's Chicago. And then Murray Rothbard said, well, what's the Austrians? We're the no-water economists, because he was in Las Vegas, Nevada, and there's no water there. Mm-hmm. Fresh water would be the Chicago School. Well, all three schools of thought, saltwater, freshwater, and no water, believe in economics, and economics is the systematic study of the economy. Where we diverge from those two guys is that we see and by the way, if you ask 10 Austrians, you're going to get 11 answers on this. This is my own view. I don't speak for all Austrians, but I speak for some, and I've been trained by Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises indirectly. So the main difference, and I think you put your finger on it, was that theirs is an empirical science. Mm-hmm. Ours is more a matter of pure logic. It's right. More like a deductive system, which doesn't mean that we're not open to econometrics and empirical work. It's just that we view it differently. Let me give you an example.
Yeah.
I have here a pen, and I bought this pen for $1. And I know for sure, axiomatically, deductively, apodictically, that at the time I bought this pen, I valued it at more than $1.
Right.
Because if I valued it less than $1, I'd lose money on the deal. And if I valued it exactly at $1, why would I bestir myself to trade $1 for the pen when the pen didn't be no more good than the $1? Mm-hmm. So I had to value it at more than the pen. Now, you sold me this pen, and you're a pen salesman, and you had 3,000 of them, and you're dying to get rid of them, and you valued it at a penny, and you made a 99% profit. or 99-cent profit, and I valued it at $1.25. So I made a 25-cent profit. And I say axiomatically that all voluntary trade is mutually beneficial in the ex ante sense.
Mm-hmm.
Now,
Right.
ex post, who knows? Maybe it didn't work that well, or maybe you regretted your sale. But usually, even ex post, nobody regrets buying a pen.
Right.
But axiomatically, there was mutual benefit. Now, how do you test that?
Mm-hmm.
You can't test that.
Yep.
It's sort of like testing that bachelors are unmarried or that triangles have 360 degrees. You can't test it. You can illustrate it,
Right.
but you can't test it. And to think that you have to test it is problematic. I don't think you can. Let me give you another example. My PhD dissertation was on rent control.
Right.
And Gary Becker was my dissertation advisor, who was a mainstream economist, a very famous Nobel Prize winning economist. And I was doing econometric regressions. And I was supposedly testing the theory that rent control screws up housing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we know that rent control screws up housing because, there'll be less investment in residential rental units because you can invest in any other area of the economy, and the revenuers or the bureaucrats are not going to be on your case.
Yeah.
But in this one area, they'll get you. So resources will tend to flow elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I say this is necessarily true, ceteris paribus, other things equal.
Yeah.
So I'm doing my econometrics, and I'm trying to show that the more rent control, the worse the housing, holding everything else I can think of constant, like wealth or weather or God knows what.
Mm-hmm.
And most of the times I got the right sign, and it was statistically significant, and everything was hunky-dory. Every once in a while, I would get the wrong sign, and God forbid it was statistically significant.
Mm-hmm.
I told Gary this. If he was a good neoclassical economist, he should have said, "Oh, I've got this young genius. I was young then. Block. Going to show that we know nothing about rent control, and maybe sometimes it helps." But instead, what he said, as an Austrian, he said, "Block, go out and do it again till you get it right." So what was testing what? My crappy econometrics testing what we know about rent control, or what we know about rent control testing my empirical work?
Right.
So again, Austrians are not against empirical work. It's just that the way I would interpret what I was doing is I was trying to illustrate it. I wasn't trying to test the minimum wage or rent control or free trade or voluntary interaction or anything like that. So to me, this is the essence of Austrian economics. There are many other areas where we diverge from the mainstream: business cycles, antitrust laws, indifference, whole bunches of things. But to me, that's the important distinction.
Right. And praxeology. Can you just explain that for the audience, because that's the key component of what you're just talking about?
Yeah. Well, praxeology is the logic of choice.
Mm-hmm.
Mises started with human action, people act. Well, if they act, this must mean that things aren't the way they would like them to be.
Right.
Otherwise, they wouldn't act.
Mm-hmm.
And yet we know that people act. So you get a deductive system. Well, if you act, that means you prefer satisfaction sooner rather than later, because if you preferred it later, you wouldn't act now.
Right.
And people act now. So this is sort of praxeological insight. The case of free trade or rent control, or another one would be the minimum wage law.
Mm-hmm.
We know that if you have a $20 an hour minimum wage, and my productivity is $12 an hour, nobody's going to hire me.
Right.
Unless Bill Gates goes out there and wants to undermine our theory and starts hiring me, even though he's going to lose money. But ceteris paribus, assuming profit maximization, the minimum wage law is apodictically, necessarily, praxeologically going to lead to unemployment for unskilled workers.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to test this, fine, go test it. Now, Card and Kruger tested it and couldn't find the result. And then people start saying, well, rent control, minimum wage really doesn't work that way. No. Mm-hmm. So from a praxeological point of view, we Austrians insist that it works that way.
Yeah, well, it's here in California. I think it's been proven again recently with the minimum wage increases and the amount of layoffs that followed it. So here's the other thing: is right. So the Austrians put an emphasis on uncertainty and imperfect knowledge, right? Shaping economic decisions, and I feel like today, I mean, especially over the last number of years, the amount of entrepreneurial activity and the different types of businesses that have cropped up that nobody could really have predicted. I mean, you have an influencer economy. Who knew people posting pictures on Instagram could become an economic, powerhouse, right? So you've got all of these different businesses that nobody, like a couple of years ago, nobody would even have envisioned, right? So therefore, from my point of view, it would seem that the Austrian school is kind of better placed to understand or to be able to talk to this than Neoclassical, where everything is kind of put in boxes.
Yes, I like the way you put it, put in boxes. The box is perfect competition or imperfect competition or oligopoly or monopoly. These are the boxes that the mainstream puts the economy in. And we Austrians don't much like these boxes. I mean, perfect competition means you have a million or an uncountable number of buyers and sellers, and you have a homogeneous product, and everyone has the same cost curves, and okay, it has some value. I'm not totally against looking at that box, but to make that box the crucial point, and then to predicate a public policy like antitrust on the basis of that, because the real world is not like that at all, and therefore we can have antitrust on anyone. I have to tell you my antitrust joke. Please. My antitrust joke is, if you charge a higher price than anyone else, you're guilty of profiteering. If you charge a lower price than anyone else, you're guilty of predatory price cutting. If you charge the same price as everyone else, you're guilty of collusion. Well, I mean, this is the mainstream, and they so the Austrians would diverge from the mainstream on antitrust. We would say that antitrust law is preposterous and nonsensical. The only monopolies are if you do something, you go to jail. Like the post office is a monopoly, because if you go delivering mail, you go to jail, or things like that. Or taxi cabs in New York City, you start driving a cab that you're not allowed to. That's a monopoly. But the idea that McDonald's, if it beats out Burger King and Wendy's and becomes the only fast food place, is a monopoly is preposterous. And yet, two airlines want to merge, and according to the mainstream, well, we have to figure out, well, what's the concentration ratio, and we're off to the races. I mean, it's a full employment law for economists.
Right.
Speaking of which, the Fed employs, I don't know, like 400 economists or something like that. So they love the Fed, whereas the Austrians would say, end the Fed with Ron Paul.
Right. And just on that point, on money and that, just explain how the Austrians view that.
Well, the Austrian, I mean, you have to distinguish between normative and positive economics. Positive economics is what Austrian is all about.
Yeah.
Namely, what causes what, and that's what all the good economics is about. Whereas normative economics is what should we do, which is a very different kind of a universe of discourse. So I would say we should get rid of rent control. We should get rid of the minimum wage. We should get rid of the Fed. But insofar as I'm saying that, I'm not really speaking as an Austrian, and sort of as a quasi-Austrian.
Right.
So with money, the positive part of it is what causes inflation, and what causes inflation is the Fed. Right. Fine. Should we get rid of the Fed? I would say, as a libertarian, oh yes, we should get rid of the Fed, and we should have. I mean, why do we have money in the first place? The reason we have money in the first place is that it facilitates trade.
Yeah.
Because if we don't have money, all we have is barter, and barter is very inefficient. So what should be a good money? Well, bananas can't be a good money because they rot.
Right.
Cement can't be a good money because you have to carry so much of it around to buy a banana.
Right.
Diamonds can't be a good money because if you split them in two, you lose 7/8 of the value or something like that. And it's very hard to split them into and make change. You can't make change in diamonds. Gold, whenever people were free to choose, they chose gold, sometimes silver, but mainly gold. Milton Friedman has a TV series called Free to Choose. And yet he was a bitter opponent of gold, even though people chose gold when they were free to choose. And his argument is, well, it costs money to dig it up, and then it costs money to store it in Fort Knox or in a bank or whatever. And we could save this money by having fiat currency.
Right.
Well, the Fed started in 1913, and they were supposed to protect the value of the dollar, and they protected the value of a dollar by about 1%. 99% of the value is gone. So gold is like an insurance policy, and I think most Austrians would favor, as speaking normatively, not the gold standard, but whatever the market chooses. And if the market chose platinum this time, or Bitcoin, or whatever the market chooses, but we say gold because whenever the market was free to choose, it chose gold.
Yeah, and now we're kind of, and now we're sort of addicted, aren't we, to rate cuts and watching the Fed and what's the Fed going to do next, and it's almost like we take all our cues from there, and that seems to be kind of what the neoclassicals want in many ways, is to be able to kind of dictate monetary policy.
Absolutely, I mean, but that's central planning of an important part of the economy. Money is the lifeblood, and money is to the economy as blood is to the body.
Yeah.
Why should central planners determine the interest rate? They don't determine the price of pens, and they know that wage and price controls don't work and are very problematic. Well, why have interest rates or inflation rates determined by a central bank? Ron Paul says famously, "End the Fed," and I certainly support him. As a normative Austrian economist, there's no reason why a bunch of people should get together and determine such an important thing as, look, if they want to determine the price of pens, God bless them, let them go determine the price of pens. They'll screw up pens. But money is very important. So if you have to have central planning, let's do it for paper clips. Not that I favor that, but I'm trying to make a point here.
Yeah. Well, if they do that, then we can all speculate on paper clips. Then if you get in early, because they'll end up being overpriced. And it kind of gets back to that idea of neoclassicals, like emphasizing equilibrium, right? Equilibrium analysis for understanding market processes, where the Austrians are looking at the dynamic and constant changing. And what are the practical implications of looking at it in two different ways?
Well, I think that's a very important, another area where we two diverge. Now, look, I'm not against equilibrium. I don't think that it's a totally nonsensical thing. It's just that we're never at equilibrium. We're always moving toward equilibrium, but as soon as we move toward this equilibrium, something else changes. The price of beer goes up and people don't want pretzels as much, or God knows what. And then we're off to another equilibrium. So the interesting point, says Hayek, is not what's true or not true at equilibrium. It's interesting, but peripheral. What's really important is the movement of the situation. And now you get into entrepreneurship. Yeah. Because entrepreneurs, Israel Kirzner wrote a book, I think it was called Competition and Entrepreneurship, and he emphasized entrepreneurship. Whereas you look in the textbook of many mainstream textbooks, either entrepreneurship is missing entirely or it's got one page. Whereas for the Austrians, our middle name might as well be entrepreneurship. Maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but entrepreneurship is very important for the Austrians. And for them, it's what's true or not true at equilibrium. And since we're not at equilibrium, this opens up the idea of market failure. Here's another concept where we all disagree. Namely, they think there is such a thing as market failure. We Austrians don't think there's any such thing as market failure. What are the market failures? Monopoly, externalities, public goods, inequality, asymmetric information. So that would be another area where we strongly diverge.
Yeah, because we would, as you said, market failures, you would see this as the market behaving exactly as it should at that moment.
Precisely.
Given the conditions.
Right. And just because it's not in equilibrium doesn't mean it's a failure, because we're never at equilibrium. And if somehow by chance we were at total equilibrium, that would last 1 second. And then somebody would get up and buy Rice Krispies instead of a burger. And then we'd be off to the races.
Yeah. And it's interesting just on the entrepreneurial side, because I do feel like, I mean, we're entering almost, I think the golden age of entrepreneurialism, because of, I mean, we live in a world now where I could right now decide to start a business, use online tools, resources from around, contract resources from around the globe, and come up with, so it's the barrier to entry to entrepreneurship is going down all the time. And again, like you said earlier, is the entrepreneurs are the people who create markets, who create new opportunities, who solve problems. It's a very dynamic thing, but it doesn't seem to be as supported by governments as it should be. That's the thing that always kind of baffles me, why governments don't generally support entrepreneurialism in the way they talk about it, but they don't really support it.
Well, here, by the way, I'm not as optimistic as you. I don't see free entry all over the place. I see restrictions on entry. There are Black girls who do hair braiding. Black people have very intricate styles of hair, and young girls do the hair braiding. And the government wants to put them in jail because they don't have a beautician's license. Now, why they need a 3-year license that costs $100,000 in order to do what they're expert in anyway is silly. And then when Uber and Lyft came along, the taxi cab industry didn't much like it and tried to stop them. And also, Milton Friedman here is very good. Chapter 9 of his Capitalism and Freedom, he says, look, I want to become a doctor. I have a doctorate, by the way, in economics, and I want to set up myself as a medical doctor. I go to jail for that. Now, it's true, I'm not going to get any customers, but why should I go to jail as long as I don't commit any fraud?
Right.
And then you have problems. Why is medical service so expensive? And it's so expensive because the AMA limits very strictly the number of freshman medical students. And why? Because they want to keep prices up. Yeah. So I'm not as optimistic as you are, as you articulated a minute ago, about no restriction on entry. But I think the public choice school, which is another free enterprise school started by Buchanan and Tullock, makes a very good contribution here. You said, well, why is there so much restriction on entry? Tariffs are another restriction on entry.
Right.
The U.S. Steel doesn't want Japanese steel within 1 million miles of the U.S., and that would be another restriction. And what the public choice school would say is this is rent seeking. I don't like the phrase, what's wrong with rent? But the idea here is that there's money to be made by restricting entry. I think that the Burger King would love to have a law saying that no new burger places could ever come into existence. Not that I'm accusing them of that, but you could see the incentive that they would have, and that's why we have so much of that. It's no accident that I think 9 out of 10 of the richest counties in the U.S. are all around Washington, D.C.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And why? Well, because that's where the deals get made. All the money goes there. Some of it comes back, and they keep quite a bit of it. And what are they keeping? Bribery for rent seeking or restriction on entry.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think the opportunities, in other words, I think, the mechanics and mechanisms for entrepreneur, there's so many options are being open. But you're right. I mean, in terms of, I don't underestimate the government, trying to put up barriers. I just think it's going to get harder and harder for them because of I think there's more kind of global autonomy in many ways. And I think that may be something that can push back eventually.
Well, you're an optimist, and I hope you're right. So I wanted to tell you another story about Austrianism versus mainstream. There was this guy, a pretty famous Chicago economist, Sherwin Rosen, recently deceased, and he wrote a paper saying, well, is there any room for cooperation between the Austrians and the mainstream? And he said, no. Why not? Why not? Because everything that the Austrians contributed that was valid, like the marginal revolution, has already been incorporated into the mainstream, and everything else, namely most of Austria, is just a bunch of crap, and, and there's no need to incorporate any more. And his proof: there are more mainstream economists than Austrians. I mean, I had a full head of hair, and look at me now, pulling it out over this. So my co-authors and I said, look, you can't tell the truth based on nose counting. And one time, most physicists and astronomers thought that the sun revolved around the Earth. You can't prove anything like that. But we try to reductio ad absurdum. The reductio ad absurdum was whenever there was a debate between Austrians and the mainstream, whoever published last is right. I mean, that's equally silly because you and I are having a debate, and all of a sudden you stop because you think I'm an idiot, or God forbid you die in the middle of the debate. So the whole thing is silly. But just for the fun of it, what we did is we got 150 debates between Austrians and mainstream, and we asked who published last. And we published last 100, and they published last 50. So I concluded, my co-authors and I, that Austrian is right. But don't misinterpret this. You know, we're not saying that this is coherent. This is silly. It's a reductio ad absurdum. You can't tell truth by the number of people or by who publishes last or anything else like that. But it's interesting. You see, the mainstream think of us as a cult.
Right.
Or as a religion. Why? Because we have praxeology. And everyone knows that they're, what is it, logical positivists from the Vienna School. And everything has to be tested. And if it can't be falsified, then it's just a tautology. And we're just dealing in tautologies. And I mean, a tautology, bachelors or unmarried men, just tells how we use language. It doesn't say what the reality is.
Yep.
But when I say that the minimum wage law unemploys in equilibrium people whose productivity is lower than the level stipulated, that's not a tautology. That tells you about the real world.
Yeah, and absolutely, and it is artificially tampering with how businesses operate or should operate.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what do you see, and finally, Walter, what do you see? Do you see more people gravitating towards the Austrian school as they understand it, or do you think neoclassical has such a stranglehold on most countries?
Well, I'm a professor. I'm never allowed to answer a question, so I'll answer it indirectly. Instead of answering what's the prospects for Austrianism, I'll answer what's the prospects for libertarianism. So I once asked Murray Rothbard, how many libertarians are there? And this was 1964, maybe 65. And he said 25. 25 in the whole world. Well, how many libertarians are there now? I would say 25 million. So in proportion, we went from 25 to 25 million. That looks pretty good. On the other hand, in 1964, there were 3 million people.
Right.
So there are 8 million people. So while we went from 25 to 25 million, they went from 5 more billion people.
Right.
So now to get back to your question about Austrian economics. When I started Austrian economics, and it took me a while to get it, whereas I got libertarianism a lot easier. My estimate is to how many Austrians were there? 25. Nice round number. Right. How many are there now? My guess, I don't know, 200, 250, maybe. But there are many more economists now than there were then.
Right.
I think proportionally we're doing very well, but absolutely we're not doing well, similar to the libertarian statistics. So I think there are many more than 25 now. Right. I have 12 former students of mine who are now professors of economics.
Oh, very good.
All Austrians to some degree or other, I'm sure. And the Mises Institute, which is sort of the home ground for Austrian economics, is burgeoning. I have some problems with them over Israel, but that's a different issue. But in terms of Austrian economics, they are getting bigger and bigger. They have conferences of several hundred people. whereas when I started with them, the conferences were way smaller. So there's hope.
Good. Well, hopefully, because as I've said, we seem to have some addiction to central planning, and everybody seems to think that one flavor of central planning is better than a different flavor, but it's all flavors of central planning at the end of the day.
Precisely. Very well put.
Yeah. Well, listen, thanks a lot, Walter. This has been fascinating, really, really insightful. Thank you so much. All of Walter's information will be below this video. But before we go, Walter, please let people know a little bit more about what you do.
Well, I'm a professor of economics at Loyola University, New Orleans. And I'm always looking for students who are interested in Austrian economics and libertarian theory. So if you're of a college age or you have a grandson, granddaughter of that age, please consider enrolling at Loyola University. I have, I don't know, I write books, I write articles, I write op-eds. I keep typing. I go like this all day long, and I'm having fun. I just love it. I think sometimes the prospects for liberty are not as optimistic as they should be, but it's just so much fun to promote liberty and good Austrian economics.
Yeah, 100. Yeah, well, it's a great way to finish. It's always good to promote liberty. Absolutely love it. Well, listen, thanks again, Walter. Thank you for watching and listening. I will see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.